Hello, everybody. Let's get started on the third section here of this. Let's talk about um, the difference between um, interventions in other countries that might be seen as peacemaking or peacekeeping, and what the difference is between them. All right. So, first of all, what you got to think about is that these might be saying these might be interventions that are sanctioned by the UN and the Security Council, or they might not be. Um, so let's talk about what the difference is between getting involved in somebody else's conflict. Sometimes this could be termed peacekeeping, and there are some important differences between what we'll call a peacekeeping mission and a peacemaking mission. Peacekeeping is sort of an idea that comes out of the Cold War, where you kind of have like two global superpowers that are at each other's throats, and you need to have some sort of neutral force that can be between these two sides and be seen as a neutral participant to try and keep the two sides at bay. What you're going to see is after the end of the Cold War, that peacemaking sort of turns in, or peacekeeping turns into peacemaking. And this is because the nature of conflict sort of changes after the Cold War, where you have in the Cold War two ideological opponents. And then after the Cold War, what you usually have is extremist elements within the society who are basically um, trying to attack the government and the what we would call like the legitimate force in society, and so it's a different sort of struggle, and because of that, the nature of peacekeeping changes, and that's where the term changes. So, anyways, what is peacekeeping? Peacekeeping is when the Security Council sends peacekeepers to a conflict when the two parties who were previously fighting each other have asked for help. Okay. So you've got country X, country Y, they're fighting each other. They come to an agreement to stop their fight, and they need somebody to make sure that the fighting has stopped and that it will stay stopped. Okay. So it's like a person to kind of make sure, like a referee, you go sit in your corner of the boxing match, you go sit in your corner, and you guys just chill. Okay. That's what they're there for. So this is where you see the name peacekeeping. The peace has already been made between the two parties, and your role is to keep them apart from each other. And with that space, you're giving them time so that these conflicting parties can build trust. And the thing about peacekeepers is that usually the forces are sent by many different member nations. So you might have troops from Gabon and from South Africa and Italy and Egypt, and they're all serving together under one force. So you as an individual nation can assign your soldiers to a UN peacekeeping mission, but once they're a part of that peacekeeping mission, they're under the command of the United Nations. So the United Nations doesn't have a military force of their own. They really rely on the soldiers that other nations are donating for these missions. Okay, and I put donation in quotation marks for lack of a better word. Um, the thing about peacekeeping is that the rules of engagement are typically defensive. And you'll remember this from in grade 10 when you talked about the Rwandan genocide, where the UN peacekeepers were not allowed to use their weapons unless they were fired upon. So if I'm a UN peacekeeper and I see an innocent person over there being hacked to death with a machete, I can't just shoot the aggressor. The person who's doing the killing has to actually come after me for me to engage, right? And so this was probably one of the things that infuriated you in learning about that genocide, was that there were soldiers who were trained, and they really had to play a more passive role, and the way that they saved people was not through the use of force to protect people, right? Um, and so the composition, one of the things you want to know about peacekeepers is that really since the end of the Cold War and probably even before then, the composition of peacekeeping missions has really changed radically. So when you look at the peacekeeping forces that are sent around the world today, usually their members are coming from developing countries. And there's a few reasons for that. We don't need to get into that now, but the composition of the forces are changing. And the way to think about this is that it's kind of a little bit weird, but like the most powerful countries who are a part of the Security Council are deciding where and when and why to use peacekeepers, and the developing nations, the nations that are least powerful, are the ones who are contributing the troops to enforce the Security Council directives. So I've got a little video for you here that will give you some sense of what a peacekeeping mission is like. Talks about the role of UN peacekeepers between Lebanon and Israel, and their job in sort of making sure that peace exists along that border where there has been many conflicts historically. And so to give you a sense of what a peacekeeping mission is like. All right. So, what's the difference with peacemaking? Well, the central idea of peacemaking is that conflicting parties are not always brought into the negotiating table or to the negotiating table through goodwill. And not all conflicting parties can necessarily solve their own problems. Sometimes people would argue that you need to use force to be able to bring conflicting parties together. And sometimes you might have forces like insurgent groups or terrorist groups that don't want to negotiate. So, how do you maintain peace or keep the peace in a situation where one side doesn't want peace? And that's where peacemaking comes into play. The idea is that you're going to use force to create peace. And the goal, and why the Security Council approves these, is the idea is that you can prevent a localized conflict from spreading into a larger conflict. Now, not all peacemaking nation or missions are sanctioned by the United Nations. There are a number of conflicts around the world where government X says they're invading government Y or country Y, to try and prevent the spread of instability and terrorist organizations. Um, and so it can be a little bit of a tricky situation, but so they can be authorized by the UN or they might not. But the purpose is to use a higher level of and authorize a higher level of force to make this difference. So instead of having a defensive posture and only firing if fired upon, some of these missions might have the authorized use of force to be more aggressive. And often these missions are going to be approved for places where there are fragile or failed states. So you can think of a place like the Central African Republic, where the government doesn't really have much legitimacy. Or you could look at a place like Somalia, which has basically descended into warlordism. These are the kind of countries where a peacemaking mission will be sent because you don't have warring parties, you just have chaos. And so again, these can be through the UN, they can be through other multilateral organizations. It really depends. So I gave you this video because what you should see. So the Congo is kind of like in this place that's between a peacekeeping mission and a peacemaking mission. And what you should see here is you watch this video is an escalation from the previous video. It definitely seems like the soldiers are doing far more than just watching two sides. They're getting involved, they're in the fight, they're tracking down the groups of people who are attacking civilians. Some people would say that the Congo is sort of the UN's first war, and that goes back historically. Uh, but it's trying to show you that difference between what would be peacekeeping and what would be peacemaking. All right. So there are some people who would be critical of either response and say that really, it's like putting on a band-aid when what you should have done is prevent the kid from jumping off a 10-story roof. That basically those are both short-term solutions that require a long-term solution instead that really fix the problem. And that's where you get into this idea of peace building. The idea that often the reason why conflicts occur is because of poverty or because states lack the ability to basically govern their country. And so the focus here is on improving economic conditions within the country and improving the institutions of government. And so I have here things like the rule of law. So, like, that the judges and the politicians aren't corrupt. Democratic institutions, you have political parties and free and fair elections. So, the idea or concept here is that if we fix these other problems, the conflict will go away because society will be more prosperous, and prosperous societies lack these types of conflicts. So a good example of this is you guys may have know in Haiti, there's been civil strife for decades, and we could probably talk about centuries. But that internal conflict between different armed groups, you have crime, corruption, then you had a terrible earthquake. Then you had cholera outbreaks. It was horrible. Um, and Canada's response has been, hey, let's actually look at the institutions that exist within Haiti. And if we look at a country like the Dominican Republic, it's had environmental disasters and earthquakes, but it hasn't descended into lawlessness and chaos like Haiti has. So maybe what we need to do is focus on these institutions. And so one of the things that Canada has done is we've sent RCMP members down to Haiti to try and help police and especially police leadership try to figure out how they can prevent their frontline staff, the police officers working in the streets and in the communities, from trying to engage in bribery and corruption and things like that. So that's where we would talk about peace building as kind of like an alternative solution to either of those. It's more of a response based on addressing those humanitarian concerns. All right. Oh my goodness. So what I want you to do now is you're going to exit from this video here in a second. You're going to go back to your deep thoughts. And what I like you to do is just summarize, if you could, each of the different approaches to conflict. And sort of for yourself, you want to be able to find an easy way to remember how do I differentiate these three different things. Okay. So do that for a few minutes. And then what you're going to do, you're going to come back. You're going to listen to another couple of lessons, and then we're going to be good. Um, all right, so give me a second, stop the recording, go do your stuff, then come back here.